Hi folks and welcome back. So we now have a picture before us of what stakeholder theory looks like, what this account is supposed to, how this account is supposed to differ from shareholder theory, and what sorts of changes in management style it's supposed to entail, or in management decision making it's supposed to entail. According to stakeholder theory, management's job is to balance the interests of a variety of different stakeholders, none of which take precedence over the others. Each of them has a right to not be treated as a mere means to the ends of the others. And so each of their interests need to be taken into account as business decisions are made. And the thought from, or the argument from Freeman is that in doing so, in running a business that aims to balance the interests of all of the stakeholders, that is, the owners of the business, the managers of the business, the employees of the business, the customers of the business, the suppliers of the business, and the local community in which the business is embedded, a business will thrive. It will generate profits. So with this picture in front of us, we now want to ask, what are the arguments for it? What arguments can Freeman give both against Friedman, against what he calls managerial capitalism, which is essentially Friedman's shareholder account, and in favor of the stakeholder account? What sorts of positive arguments can be given? In this video, I'm going to look at the negative arguments, the arguments against managerial capitalism. So Freeman gives us two different kinds of arguments, a legal argument and an economic argument against managerial capitalism. And in both of these cases, the structure of the argument is the same. He's going to argue that in fact, we don't let businesses operate in the way that managerial capitalism says they ought to operate. So the standard story from managerial capitalism, from someone like Friedman, is that management has a fiduciary obligation to shareholders, and they must vigorously pursue the shareholders' interests under the constraint of the law. And so managers are entrusted by shareholders to do their bidding, to operate in the shareholders' best interest, which means to maximize returns on their investment, to maximize profits. And they are to do this, to vigorously pursue these interests, insofar as the law will allow them to do this, right? So they're not allowed to break the law to do it, but they're supposed to push right up to that limit in order to maximize profits. And early on in the game, right, early on in the game of capitalism, there weren't many constraints on what businesses could do. The law allowed them a lot of leeway. But that has changed over time. And that brings us to the legal argument. Case law has evolved over the last century, century and a half, to effectively constrain management. Managers cannot simply pursue stockholder or shareholder interests at the expense of customers, suppliers, employees, or the local community. Cases brought before the courts over the last century and a half have reined in the ability of management to do this. For example, liability law prevents them from using customers as a mere means to their end by selling them faulty products. They are not allowed to stiff their suppliers, and labor laws prevent them from taking advantage of their employees, unfairly using their market advantage over their employees, the market power they have over their employees, to coerce them into working longer hours, or taking cheaper wages, lower wages, or working in unsafe conditions. And local communities have regulated the pollution that comes out of various industries, and the use of resources, the use of local resources by various industries. And so and those regulations have been held up in court, so that corporations are no longer able to simply do as they will to increase the profits and increase returns to their investors. This goes to show for Freeman that we do not, in fact, allow corporations to just run wild, to just run amok. We do, by law, hold them accountable to these other stakeholders. We do not allow them to merely treat these other stakeholders as a means to their own ends. And if we operate businesses, his thought is, if we operate corporations as if they weren't facing this constraint, as we treated this as a sort of side constraint on their behavior and said they should still try to maximize profit and just not run astray of the law, we're going to continue to see a regulatory squeeze on them, and we're going to see them continue to run afoul of these other stakeholders in ways that jeopardize the well-being of the corporation, jeopardize the long-term interests of the business. So his thought is corporations would be better off if they operated in such a way that they built in the interests of these various stakeholders. They did what the community was regulating them into doing of their own accord, because it's in their own best interest. It's in the long-term best interest of the business, and it's what they're morally obligated to do. So we see that managerial capitalism is being regulated into submission from this perspective. What's the economic argument? Well, here he talks about three different problems that arise in the context of managerial capitalism that communities have begun to regulate against. So the first is something called the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is the idea that no one has an incentive to incur the cost of maintaining the commons. Right? So the commons is the stuff that we hold in common good. The stuff that we hold as the community itself has ownership over, no individual has ownership over. So the common example is grazing land. If the community has, think of a small agrarian community, they have common grazing land, and everyone uses that to graze their sheep on or to graze their cattle on. And if it's not something that's owned by anyone in particular, no one has an incentive to manage that property in a way that is going to maintain it for the long term. Everyone's just going to try to extract everything they can from it. No one's going to sort of hold back and think about, I'm going to need that next week or next month or next year. And if everyone's acting in that way, then the commons will wither and die. No one's going to be maintaining them or caring for them. This is a kind of free rider problem. Everyone's trying to take care of themselves, to get their own resources out without concerning themselves with the well-being of the common good itself. And he says firms have an incentive under managerial capitalism to internalize the benefits and externalize the costs of business practices. So as a corporation, you pollute as much as is necessary in order to make your product as cheaply and efficiently as you possibly can. That pollution has costs for the environment. It has costs for the local community. It has costs for the global community. But those costs are externalities to your business model. Those costs are not costs that you as the business incur, rather costs that the community incurs, and as other businesses see it in exactly the same way. And this is why pollution becomes a major problem, or CO2 emissions become a major problem, because no individual corporation is incentivized to care about it. Moral hazards are a little bit different, right? In the case of a moral hazard, firms have little incentive to economize since they can pass on the costs of goods and services to their consumers. So this leads to poor resource management. It also leads to inefficiency in the operation of a business because if they don't have to incur the costs of those inefficiencies or of their poor resource management, if they can just pass those costs along, then they have no incentive to worry about those costs. They just will pass them along, and this is in the end bad for everyone. And monopolization is the last one he points to. Firms are largely anti-competitive. They try to stay out of each other's way, not compete with each other. They try to give each other space in the market. And this leads to market inefficiencies. It leads to monopolies. It leads to deadweight loss. And the outcome of all three of these problems is greater regulation. In order to prevent the tragedy of the commons, we regulate emissions, we regulate pollution from firms. In order to avoid these moral hazards, we develop regulations about efficiency and resource management and about what costs can be passed along. In order to avoid monopolization, we have antitrust laws. And this regulation is costly. It's costly for firms to engage, adhere to. It reduces their profits. The regulatory burden is borne in the form of additional paperwork, additional bookkeeping that needs to be done, as well as the constraints that they face in the way they operate their business. And it is costly in the sense that as they run up against greater and greater regulation, the firm itself can lose face, can look bad, and consumers may turn away from them as a result. So if greater regulation and decreased profits for the firm are the outcomes here, perhaps the firm would be better off not focusing on maximizing profits and returns for shareholders, but better off instead focusing on managing the competing interests of the various stakeholders themselves. That's Freeman's thought. So we've now got these two arguments against managerial capitalism, against Friedman's shareholder theory. In the next video, I want to look at the positive arguments for stakeholder theory.